Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back, way back, to a time when the night sky wasn't just a pretty backdrop for Instagram poetry, but a living, breathing map. The kind you could actually get lost in. Picture this. You're crouched in a dimly lit Babylonian temple, your fingers tracing grooves in a clay tablet still damp from yesterday's rain. The air smells like burnt cedar and the kind of incense that makes your eyes water. A priestess nudges you aside to correct your clumsy star symbols. Venus doesn't rise there, you absolute amateur. And you realize with a sinking feeling that you'd last about 3 minutes in this job before being demoted to goat sacrifice cleanup duty. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Is it 2 a.m. in Tokyo? High noon in Reykjavik? Let's pretend we're all part of some global, sleep-deprived stargazing cult. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not just looking at the stars tonight, you're logging them. Because in 1800 BCE, astronomy isn't a hobby, it's civil service. The Babylonians believed the gods wrote their moods in celestial cursive, and it's your job to translate. Every flicker of Jupiter, every hiccup in the moon's path, gets notched into clay like a grocery list for the divine. Historians still argue whether these priestesses were doing science or high-stakes astrology, but honestly, what's the difference when the king's bad harvest prediction gets you fired or worse? Here's a mainstream fact to cling to. The Venus tablet of Amisadika from around 1600 BCE is the oldest surviving planetary record, tracking Venus's movements for 21 years. But here's the quirky bit. Some tablets include error reports, like a Yelp review for the cosmos. Mars was late by 12 degrees last Tuesday. 1-star rating. Would not recommend. You wipe sweat from your brow. It's always sweat, never glamorous desert wind, and squint at the sky. The priestess next to you mutters about an encroaching shadow, but it's just a cloud. Or is it? The real horror isn't monsters. It's realizing you've mixed up your cuneiform for eclipse and tax receipt. The priestess rolls her eyes at your shaky cuneiform and hands you a reed stylus, the ancient equivalent of being tossed a spare pencil in math class. You're in Hypatia's Alexandria now, where the air smells of papyrus and the faintest hint of olive oil burning in library lamps that never quite go out. Around you, students whisper about geometry, while Hypatia herself demonstrates how to measure the distance to the moon using an astrolabe. You try to follow along, but honestly, you're just impressed she hasn't stabbed anyone with that pointed teaching rod yet. Here's the mainstream fact to tuck under your pillow. Hypatia was one of the first recorded female mathematicians and astronomers, running Alexandria's Neoplatonist school in the 4th century AD. But here's the quirky tidbit. Her most famous student, Synesius, wrote letters complaining about how hard her classes were, the ancient version of college kids moaning about 8 a.m. lectures. Historians still argue whether she invented the hydrometer or just improved existing designs. But either way, you're pretty sure she could have calculated exactly how done with your nonsense she was. You squint at the astrolabe in your hands, its brass discs catching the Mediterranean sunlight. Hypatia explains how to align it with Polaris, but you're distracted by the graffiti some student carved into the desk. If the Earth moves, why don't we fall off? Followed by what looks like a very crude drawing of. Well, best not to dwell on that. The candle flickers as your numb fingers clutch the quill, copying yet another constellation onto vellum that cost more than your entire village's annual wool production. Welcome to the scriptorium of a 12th century German abbey, where you, yes you, the one who can barely read modern star charts without an app, are now a non-astronomer charged with preserving celestial knowledge. The other sisters argue softly in Latin about whether that new blur near Orion is a comet or just Abbess Hildegard's terrible eyesight. Turns out medieval corrective lenses were basically polished quartz held together with hope. Mainstream fact: medieval convents were unexpected hubs of astronomical study, with nuns like Hildegard of Bingen recording supernovae that Chinese astronomers also noted in 1054 AD. Quirky detail: some star charts included biblical figures awkwardly pasted over pagan constellations. Imagine Orion suddenly wearing a tunic and holding a loaf of fish. Historians still argue whether these edits were pious censorship or just bored nuns doodling during Vespers. Your back aches from hunching, and you're pretty sure that's not ink on your sleeve, but a suspiciously shaped wine stain. As you blow on the parchment to dry it, Sister Gertrude elbows you sharply. Apparently, sighing too loudly is a one-way ticket to penitent's duty. The comet/eyesight debate escalates until someone suggests consulting the monastery's resident expert, Brother Gerbert, who once read half of Ptolemy's Almagest and now won't stop talking about celestial spheres at dinner. The smell of molten glass and crushed herbs hits your nose as you step into the dim workshop of Miriam al-Asturlabi, 10th century instrument maker extraordinaire. Around you, apprentices grind lenses while debating whether Jupiter's retrograde motion is an astronomical phenomenon or just Allah testing their patience. Miriam shoves a newly polished brass plate into your hands, her latest astrolabe design, with star maps so precise they could make a modern GPS blush. You try to look intelligent while holding it, but immediately tilt it wrong, earning a sigh that translates roughly to, "I work with actual children." Mainstream fact: Miriam was part of a golden age of Islamic astronomy, where astrolabes became the smartphones of their era. Navigation, timekeeping, even prayer scheduling. Quirky tidbit: some designs included tiny poems engraved between the latitude lines, like a love note to the cosmos. Historians still argue whether these were artistic flourishes or memory aids for sleep-deprived scholars. As you attempt to trace the engraved Tropic of Cancer, a commotion erupts outside. A local imam has declared the astrolabe suspiciously accurate, muttering about humans overstepping divine boundaries. Miriam rolls her eyes so hard you worry they'll stick. Apparently this happens every new moon. She grabs a spare instrument and whispers, "Hide this in your robe. If anyone asks, it's a very round cooking pot." The plate's sharp edges dig into your ribs as you nod, suddenly understanding why so many medieval scientists also studied theology. You needed the debate skills. The fermented mare's milk in your gut sloshes uncomfortably as the Mongol queen leans closer, her gold-embroidered sleeve brushing against your star charts. "Explain again," she says through her translator, "why Chinese astronomers think the Great Bear constellation is a chariot and not an actual bear." You swallow hard, suddenly missing the quiet scriptorium. Around you, the royal tent smells of wet sheepskin and the kind of political tension that could get a foreign stargazer thrown off the nearest cliff. Mainstream fact: Mongol queens like Sorghaktani Beki were powerful patrons of astronomy, using knowledge from conquered territories to create hybrid star maps. Quirky detail: some court astronomers kept diplomatic star logs, recording celestial events alongside which visiting envoy pissed themselves during eclipses. Historians still argue whether these were scientific records or early blackmail material. You point to a cluster of stars on your silk map, hands shaking slightly. The queen nods, then casually mentions she had the last Persian astronomer executed for inaccurate predictions. Your stomach does a backflip that has nothing to do with the mare's milk. Just as you're mentally drafting your will, a guard bursts in announcing a messenger from Baghdad, saved by the bell, or in this case, by the 13th century equivalent of a mail carrier with really good timing. The laundry basket digs into your hip as you crouch behind it, squinting at Galileo's latest sketches of Jupiter's moons. Your patron, a sharp-eyed Tuscan widow named Caterina, whispers that if the Inquisition finds those papers, you'll both be collecting firewood for your own pyres. Outside the villa, church bells toll ominously, but inside, the real danger is the pile of unwashed linens, threatening to topple and reveal your hiding spot. The scent of lavender soap nearly masks the acrid fear sweat coming from your armpits. Mainstream fact: while Galileo was under house arrest, networks of noble women and independent scholars kept his work alive by smuggling observations in laundry, books, and even baked goods. Quirky tidbit: some of these scientific pastries had star charts iced onto them, the original edible education. Historians still argue whether the Inquisition ever actually ate the evidence. Caterina adjusts her widow's veil, which you've learned is code for "shut up, someone's coming," as footsteps approach. You pretend to be fascinated by a stain on a chemise that might be wine or might be someone's attempt at recording sunspots. The footsteps pass, and Caterina mutters, "Next time, we use the hollowed-out bread loaves like normal people." You nod vigorously, making a mental note to brush up on your baking skills, right after you survive the 17th century. The pendulum clock's rhythmic ticking fills the marquise's salon as you carefully turn the winding key, trying not to think about how much this single timepiece costs. Approximately one peasant village. The Marquise du Châtelet adjusts her lace cuffs and squints at your calculations. Apparently your handwriting resembles a spider dipped in ink and set loose. Around you, the air smells of beeswax and the faintest hint of scandal, because while Voltaire naps in the next room, you're helping his genius lover prove Newton's theories right under the French Academy's nose. Mainstream fact: Émilie du Châtelet's French translation of Newton's Principia is still the standard today. Quirky tidbit: she reportedly did her best work while wearing men's clothing for comfort, occasionally forgetting and showing up to formal dinners looking like a very overeducated stable boy. Historians still argue whether her famous heated metal ball experiment, dropping weights into clay, was rigorous science or just an excuse to make a mess in Versailles. Fanciest rooms. You flinch as the clock chimes, not because it's loud, but because it reminds you that you've been awake for 32 hours straight. The Marquise tosses you a chocolate bonbon, her other great passion, and says, "If you faint, do it away from the inkwell." As sugar melts on your tongue, you idly wonder if this counts as a workplace hazard in Enlightenment-era France. Your lungs burn as you haul the brass telescope up the Andean slope, each step at 12,000 feet, feeling like someone filled your boots with lead. The nun leading your expedition, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, barely breaks a sweat, her habit flapping like a sail in the thin air. She pauses to adjust the instrument strapped to your back and says deadpan, "God gave men strength, but apparently forgot to give them endurance." The two Quechua porters snicker into their sleeves. They've been laughing at you since you needed 3 breaks before the tree line. Mainstream fact: colonial-era convents in Latin America became unexpected centers for astronomy, with nuns like Sor Juana conducting observations that challenged European models. Quirky tidbit: some convent star logs included local indigenous names for constellations alongside Catholic ones. Imagine Orion being called Saint George and the llama herder on the same parchment. Historians still argue whether these blended records were cultural diplomacy or just pragmatism when your star guide comes from people who've lived at altitude for millennia. As you finally reach the observation ledge, Sorwana produces a flask of what smells suspiciously like pulque. For the altitude, she says, though you notice she only pretends to sip. The first stars emerge like pinpricks in a violet sky, and somewhere below, a bishop is definitely not approving of this unorthodox field trip. A Harvard College observatory smells of pipe tobacco and the faint tang of developer fluid as you squint at glass plates under Williamina Fleming's watchful eye. Around you, the other computers, a team of underpaid women doing the math male astronomers considered tedious, whisper about today's indignity. Professor Pickering's latest complaint that their tea breaks are disrupting celestial mechanics. Your fingers cramp from hours tracing star spectra, and you're pretty sure the coffee stain on plate B342 is actually your tears. Mainstream fact: the Harvard computers cataloged over 10,000 stars and discovered the first spectroscopic binaries. Quirky tidbit: they developed their own housemaid's astronomy, using hat pins to mark plate defects and knitting during breaks to keep their hands from seizing up. Historians still argue whether Pickering hired women because they were meticulous, or just because he could pay them 25 cents an hour. As you rub your aching neck, Williamina slides you a secret bonus, a plate showing what might be a new variable star. "Don't tell the boys," she whispers, nodding toward the door where Pickering's assistant is definitely not eavesdropping. The thrill of discovery wars with exhaustion. You've still got 300 plates to measure tonight, and the gas lamps are giving everyone a migraine. Somewhere, a male astronomer yawns over his single assigned star, and you briefly consider revolutionary violence. The director's office at Greenwich Observatory is freezing. Whether to preserve the instruments or discourage complaints, you're not sure. You clutch your notes on the Crab Nebula's expansion, while Sir Somebody or other peers at your work like it's a suspicious mollusk. "Adorable effort," he says finally, tapping the page where your calculations prove his theory wrong. "But perhaps stick to women's astronomy. The pretty constellations, A clock ticks loudly as you count to 10 in Latin, Greek, and pure rage. Mainstream fact: early 20th century female astronomers were often restricted to women's work, like variable star analysis, despite making foundational discoveries. Quirky tidbit: some retaliated by naming celestial objects after kitchen implements, hence why there's a galaxy cluster nicknamed the casserole in private star catalogs. Historians still argue whether this was petty revenge or a legitimate classification system. The debate gets heated at conferences. You exit with what dignity you can muster, nearly colliding with a junior male colleague who's never calculated a damn thing in his life. He helpfully suggests you smile more as you pass. Back at your desk, you sharpen your pencils with unnecessary force. The nebula won't map itself, and unlike certain directors, you actually care about getting it right, even if your name ends up in footnote purgatory. Blackout curtains turn the Yerkes Observatory into a cave as you hunch over a star chart, red flashlight clamped in your teeth. Outside, it's 1943, and the war means no city lights can betray bomber routes, but inside you're using 9th century Polynesian navigation techniques to help pilots because those primitive methods suddenly seem less primitive when radar gets jammed. The irony tastes better than your cold coffee. Mainstream fact: WW2 saw astronomers revive ancient wayfinding techniques for military navigation when technology failed. Quirky tidbit: some pilots got star maps embroidered on silk, less for practicality and more because a Royal Navy commander thought it looked dashing. Historians still argue whether these hybrid methods actually worked or just gave crews placebo confidence. A colleague slides you a sandwich that might contain actual meat, a wartime miracle. As you eat, you idly correct his star angles, using a chant you learned from a Maori sky lore text. He blinks. How'd you know that? You shrug. Someone had to read the unimportant ethnomathematics papers while the men were busy dismissing them. Outside, a bomber roars overhead, its path traced by stars your ancestors named millennia ago. The radio telescope's hum is giving you a toothache as you stare at the wiggly line that might be, no, definitely is a pulsar. Your male supervisor peers over your shoulder and says, "Cute little squiggle, almost looks real." The other women in the lab freeze, waiting for your reaction. You take a deep breath and say, with lethal calm, "Funny, that's exactly what your wife texted me last night." The room goes so silent, you can hear the pulsar's heartbeat through the speakers. Mainstream fact: radio astronomy's early days were marked by gender barriers, with women like Jocelyn Bell Burnell making landmark discoveries, like pulsars, that were initially credited to male advisors. Quirky tidbit: some female researchers communicated through astro-sarcasm, like labeling interference patterns male ego noise in internal documents. Historians still argue whether the field's culture has improved or just gotten subtler. You turn back to your screen, where the data doesn't lie, even if tenure committees do. The supervisor slinks away, and someone slides a sticky note onto your monitor, a doodle of him as a black hole sucking up credit. You file the pulsar under Bell's star in your private notes, because history might forget, but you won't. The Apollo Guidance Computer Manual weighs roughly as much as a small moon. As you debug code that could, if you fail, leave astronauts stranded in orbit. Around you, MIT's rote mothers, the women who literally wove memory cores by hand, gossip about which engineer just got chewed out for assuming the moon's gravity was like Wisconsin's. Your eyes ache from staring at hex dumps, and you're pretty sure the coffee in your mug is just hot resentment at this point. Mainstream fact: NASA's early missions relied on teams of female mathematicians and programmers, many uncredited until recently. Quirky tidbit: some spacecraft trajectories were initially plotted using knitting techniques, because who else knew how to turn complex equations into patterns? Historians still argue whether this was innovation or just proof that women's work was always rocket science. A programmer rushes in with news: the latest test flight failed because someone, probably Dave, used imperial units instead of metric. As the room erupts, you quietly fix 3 more bugs, because while the boys panic, the women are busy saving the space program. Again, the jungle humidity makes your notebook pages stick together as you crouch in a half-excavated Mayan observatory. Your local guide, a grandmother who remembers star stories from her own grandmother, points to a carving and says, "That's not a war prediction. It's a grocery list for eclipse parties." The grad students taking notes look scandalized. Around you, the smell of copal incense mixes with bug spray in a truly unholy aroma. Mainstream fact: modern archaeoastronomy is rediscovering how indigenous cultures tracked celestial events with precision rivaling telescopes. Quirky tidbit: some Mayan Star Wars records may actually be ancient Yelp reviews. 1 star for Venus alignment. Priest showed up late. Sacrifices were cold. Historians still argue whether these systems were astronomy or astrology. But then again, so do modern astronomers at faculty happy hours. You carefully photograph the carving, aware that your dissertation committee would faint at the idea of oral history being valid data. The grandmother winks and produces a flask of something that smells like fermented starlight. "For science," she says, and really, who are you to argue? The planetarium dome above you swirls with constellations as today's keynote speaker finally mentions Henrietta Leavitt by name. Around you, junior astronomers, many in Real Women Make Their Own Light t-shirts, stifle cheers. The air smells like stale popcorn and generational vindication. Mainstream fact. The past decade has seen belated recognition for historical women astronomers through renamed craters, posthumous awards, and Wikipedia editathons. Quirky tidbit? Some modern telescopes now get makeup calls, observation time reserved specifically to re-examine objects first noted by overlooked researchers. Historians are, for once, not arguing, but rather frantically updating textbooks. As the lights come up, you spot a little girl in a too big conference lanyard, staring at the dome with wide eyes. You slip her your notes, the good ones, with doodles in the margins. She might never have to hide star charts in laundry or pretend her ideas came from a male colleague. Then again, the coffee here still sucks, and someone just called the only female keynote speaker feisty. Progress is a spiral galaxy, not a straight line.